The wind screamed through the pines that night, cold enough to bite through bone. Inside a lonely log cabin at the edge of the Montana wilderness, Sarah Whitmore fought for her life and her babies. Sweat poured down her pale face as pain tore through her body. "Marcus, please," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. But Marcus sat at the table, half drunk and angry, staring at the whiskey bottle instead of his wife. The baby's cry broke the silence, a tiny, fragile sound of life. Sarah gasped in relief, lifting her newborn to her chest. Then Marcus turned, saw the child, and his face twisted into disgust. "A girl," he spat. "Worthless." He lurched to his feet, knocking the chair over. Sarah tried to shield the baby, whispering, "Please, she's ours, she's beautiful." But his rage boiled over. He struck her once, twice, again, until blood splattered across the floorboards. Sarah crumpled over the crying infant, trembling arms trying to protect her child. Marcus shouted curses, his drunken voice echoing in the storm outside, until at last he stumbled back to his chair, muttering, "Should have been a boy," before passing out cold. The fire burned low, throwing trembling shadows over the broken scene. Miles away in town, Sheriff Tom Coleman sat in his office, staring into the dim light of the oil lamp. The night had been long and quiet, too quiet, until the sound came, distant but sharp. A woman's scream. Coleman froze, listening. The wind carried it faintly again, a high, desperate wail from the west woods. He pushed back from his desk and grabbed his rifle. That sound had stirred something buried deep inside him, something raw and familiar. 3 years ago, he'd heard a scream just like it. His wife, Emma. And by the time he'd reached her, both she and their newborn son were gone. He shook off the memory, jaw tight. Not this time. Not again. He mounted his horse and kicked hard, galloping into the storm. The snow stung his face, the trees looming like ghosts as he followed the faint glow of a cabin lamp ahead. The front door hung open, swinging with the wind. Coleman stepped inside, rifle raised. The smell hit him first, blood and whiskey. The scene froze his breath. A woman sprawled in a crimson pool, motionless, a baby crying weakly from a pile of rags, and a man at the table, eyes glassy, muttering nonsense. "Sir," Coleman barked, rushing forward. Marcus blinked up, slurring, "She failed me. Gave me a worthless girl. That was enough." Coleman struck him hard, sending the drunk crashing to the floor. He cuffed him on the spot, voice low and shaking with fury. "You just lost every right you ever had." Coleman checked the woman. She was breathing, barely. He tore off his coat, pressing it to her wound. "Stay with me, ma'am," he whispered. "You're going to be all right." The baby's cry broke again, thin and frightened. Coleman turned, lifted the child gently into his arms, and for the first time in years felt something break inside his chest. Her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, fragile but determined. He swallowed hard. "Hang on, little one," he murmured. "We're getting you both out of here." He tied Marcus to his horse and slung the woman over his saddle, keeping the baby close to his chest inside his coat. The snow whipped around them as he rode toward town, the horse's hooves pounding against frozen ground. Every bump made the baby stir, and he whispered, "It's all right, sweetheart, we're almost there." By the time he reached Doc Harrison's place, the lantern in the window was nearly out. Coleman kicked the door open with his boot. "Doc, get up. I got a woman hurt bad and a newborn." The old doctor stumbled out of bed, pulling on his spectacles. "Good Lord, Tom. Put her on the table." He hurried to work, barking orders as he checked her pulse and cleaned the wound. Coleman stood in the corner, still holding the baby, staring at the blood soaking into the floorboards. "She's lost too much," Doc muttered, cutting away fabric, working fast. Coleman's heart thudded. "Can you save her?" The doctor didn't look up. "I'll try." Coleman moved to the small stove, heating water, anything to help. The baby's tiny breaths brushed his neck, her warmth pressing against him. It was strange how something so small could pull a man back from the edge. He fed her a few drops of milk with a cloth, just like Doc had taught him years ago when Emma still lived. "That's it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You fight too." The hours dragged by. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, time held its breath. Finally, Doc looked up, his face pale. "Tom," he said quietly, "get in here." Coleman's blood ran cold. He handed the baby to the nurse and stepped into the back room. Sarah lay pale and still on the table, her chest rising faintly. "She's alive," Doc said, "but barely. We'll know by morning if she makes it." Coleman exhaled, nodding slowly. He looked back toward the baby, whose soft whimper filled the silence. Something fierce and protective surged through him. He turned back to document, "She will make it. Both of them will." Doc studied him a long moment. "You can't save everyone, Tom." Coleman's voice was steady, but his eyes were wet. "I couldn't save Emma, but I'll be damned if I let another woman die like this." He picked up the baby again, her small hand gripping his finger once more. For the first time since that terrible day 3 years ago, he let himself feel something other than guilt. Maybe this was what second chances looked like, not in grand miracles, but in tiny, crying bundles wrapped in borrowed coats. He sat by the fire, watching her sleep, her face soft and innocent, untouched by the world's cruelty. Behind him, Doc called out, voice grave, "Tom, get in here." Now. Coleman's heart lurched as he rose, clutching the baby tight. Whatever waited beyond that doorway would change everything. The night dragged on like it would never end. The storm outside beating against Doc Harrison's little house while the lamps burned low and steady. In the back room, Doc worked over Sarah, his hands quick but careful, muttering to himself as he stitched, bandaged, and checked her breathing again and again. In the front room, Sheriff Tom Coleman sat in the old rocking chair near the stove with a newborn in his arms, his big hands clumsy around such a tiny, warm body. He had wrapped her in one of Doc's clean towels and tucked her against his chest to keep her warm. Every now and then she let out a soft, weak cry, and he shifted her gently, whispering, "Easy now, little one. You're safe. You're safe, I promise." Doc came through once to grab more bandages, pausing just long enough to say, "She's lost a lot of blood. Next 12 hours are critical. If she makes it to morning, she's got a chance." Then he was gone again, back into the small bedroom where life and death were wrestling over Sarah Whitmore. The words "lost too much" echoed in Coleman's mind and pulled him back 3 bitter years, to Emma's pale face and the way her fingers had slipped from his grip as she gasped for air that never came. He remembered the doctor shaking his head, the tiny still form of the son he never got to hold warm. He had buried them both on the same cold afternoon, and a part of him had gone into the ground with them. Staring into the flames now, feeling the weight of the newborn against his chest, he wondered if he was about to watch the same misery happen all over again. He refused to sit and do nothing. He found some goat's milk in Doc's pantry and, following old instructions he barely remembered, soaked a clean rag and let the baby suck tiny drops from it. She latched on with surprising strength for something so small, and he felt a strange warmth in his chest as she fed. "There you go, Grace," he murmured without even thinking about what he was saying. The name just slipped out, soft and natural. "Grace," he repeated, almost testing it. It fit. By the time the first gray light of morning crept through the frosted window, his arms ached from holding her, but he would not put her down. When Doc finally came out, his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. "Well?" Coleman asked, standing up, still cradling the baby. Doc wiped his hands on a towel and sighed. "She's alive. Weak as a newborn colt, but alive. She won't be sitting up for a while. Body's been through hell. But if infection doesn't set in, she might just make it." Coleman let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding, shoulders dropping. Behind that relief, another problem rose up like a shadow. Marcus. The man was sitting in a cell now, but he was still her legal husband. And in this territory, that meant rights, ugly, painful rights the law wasn't always kind enough to question. By noon, word had started to leak into town anyway. Doc's assistant had seen Coleman ride in with the bloody woman and the infant, and talk moved faster than any horse. People whispered in the general store, at the well outside the little white church. Folks liked stories, especially when they involved sin and scandal. Sheriff brought a woman to the doctor's, said she was half dead. I heard he's keeping the baby with him. A married woman under the sheriff's roof? That's not proper. Coleman knew all of that would come, and he also knew he didn't give a damn. When Doc suggested they move Sarah to the charity house run by the church ladies, Coleman shook his head at once. No, Marcus is still her husband in the eyes of the law. If he posts bail, he could walk right in there and take her and the baby. They'd have no way to stop him. Doc frowned. And you think your place is safer? Coleman looked him straight in the eye. I know it is. My badge still means something. Document. As long as they're under my roof, they're under my protection. By late afternoon, with Sarah stabilized but unconscious, Coleman carried her carefully into a borrowed wagon, then rode alongside as they brought her to his small house on the edge of town. The baby, Grace, as he already thought of her, never left his arms. A few neighbors saw them pass. By supper, everyone in town knew that Sheriff Tom Coleman had taken a married woman and her newborn into his home. By nightfall, the church ladies were already shaking their heads and planning a visit. When Sarah finally woke, it was to the crackle of a fire and the smell of coffee and broth. Her throat felt raw, and the light hurt her eyes. For a moment, she had no idea where she was. The last thing she remembered was Marcus's fist, the taste of blood, the sound of her baby crying. Her hand flew to her stomach, then to the space beside her. My baby, she rasped, trying to sit up. The movement sent pain through her midsection, and she winced. A deep voice spoke from the doorway. Easy there, Mrs. Whitmore. You're safe. She turned her head and saw a man standing there, tall and broad-shouldered, with tired gray eyes and sheriff's badge glinting on his vest. In his arms, wrapped in a clean blanket, was her baby girl, alive and squirming. Tears filled Sarah's eyes at the sight. She's all right. The man nodded and stepped closer. She's a fighter, just like her mama, I reckon. He pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. My name's Tom Coleman. I'm the sheriff here. I found you in your cabin last night. Memory crashed back over her. The birth, Marcus's rage, the blows raining down. Her chest tightened. Marcus, she whispered, voice shaking. Where is he? He'll come for her. He said, if she was a girl, her eyes filled with terror. Please don't let him take her. He'll kill her for being a girl. The sheriff's jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked in his cheek. He leaned forward, his voice low but firm. Marcus Whitmore is in my jail, and that's where he'll stay for now. I arrested him myself. He won't lay a hand on either of you again, not while I'm breathing. She searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or cruelty, and saw only anger and something like grief. He shifted the baby carefully in her arms. Sarah held her daughter close, sobbing quietly. I don't even know your name, she whispered to the baby, then looked at the sheriff. What do they call you? Tom. Tom Coleman, he said. Sheriff Coleman, when I've got my hat on. The corner of his mouth twitched, like he was trying to remember how to smile. In her, Sarah stared down at the tiny face nestled against her chest. Grace, she said softly. Her name is Grace. Something loosened in his chest at that. Some knot he hadn't known was still there. That's a good name. He stood slowly. You're my home. I thought it was safer than anywhere else. The town might talk, but I can live with gossip. I can't live with another funeral. Later, when Sarah was strong enough to walk from the bedroom to the sitting room, she started to notice details. A woman's shawl, still draped over the back of the rocking chair, as if its owner had only just stepped away. A pair of small wooden toys, a carved horse, and a little train, set carefully on a shelf, untouched and dusted, but clearly not played with in years. A faded sketch on the wall of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. On a side table, a small, framed birth certificate with two names, one of them crossed out with a single, shaking line. She put the pieces together slowly and felt a deep ache in her chest that did not belong only to her. When Coleman caught her looking, he stopped in the doorway, hat in his hands. "My wife," he said quietly. "Emma, and our boy, Benjamin." He lived 2 hours. His eyes drifted to the toys. "I haven't had the heart to put their things away." Sarah swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know sorry doesn't change anything." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak for a moment. "It doesn't," he said at last. "But it's something." The first days under his roof were clumsy, tender, and strange. Sarah was too weak to manage much more than feeding Grace when Doc said she was strong enough and sitting up for short stretches. So Coleman stepped into the space without thinking too hard about it. He burned breakfast twice, then learned how to make oatmeal that didn't taste like ashes. He fumbled through changing cloths on Grace, turning red as a beet when she decided to show him exactly what she thought of the process. Sarah watched him from the bed, a small smile tugging at her lips. When Grace cried at night, it was often his voice that soothed her. He would pace the floor with her, bouncing gently, murmuring a lullaby he hadn't used in 3 long years, his deep voice a soft rumble. "Sleep now, little one, safe and warm." The song hurt him and healed him at the same time. Sarah noticed something else, too. The baby quieted fastest when he held her. She would stop fussing, blink those dark baby eyes up at him, and relax as if she knew his heartbeat already. Watching that, Sarah felt something in her chest she didn't quite have words for. Something like hope, something like fear, something like the first warmth after a bitter winter. On the third night, when the house was quiet and Grace finally slept in a makeshift cradle near the bed, Sarah lay propped up against pillows, watching the firelight jump on the ceiling. The question that had been growing inside her finally rose to her lips. Coleman stood by the window, hat off, watching the snow fall outside like drifting ghosts. "Sheriff?" she said softly. He turned a little. "Tom," he corrected. "In my home, just Tom." She swallowed. "Tom, then, why are you doing this? You don't know us. You don't know us anything. The town is talking. You have to know that." He stared out at the dark for a long moment before he answered. "I had a wife," he said finally. "Emma. She died bringing our son into the world. Benjamin lived for 2 hours. I buried them both the same day." His voice was steady, but the words sat heavy in the air. "Nobody did anything wrong," they said. "Nobody to blame. Just God's will." He shook his head slowly. "But nobody sat with me after. Nobody helped with the grave. Nobody stayed when I went home to an empty house. They all went back to their dinners and their warm beds." He turned then, and she saw the glisten in his gray eyes. "When I found you on that floor, bleeding out beside your baby, I heard Emma all over again. I heard myself begging God not to take her. And I thought, maybe this is God giving me a second chance. Or maybe I'm just too damn stubborn to let another woman and child die on my watch." Before she could answer, a sharp sound cut through the quiet. A horse's whinny outside, then heavy boots thudding on the porch. A hard fist pounded on the front door, rattling it in its frame. A man's voice shouted, tight with urgency, "Sheriff, Tom, Marcus Whitmore's family has posted bail. He's being released at dawn." The news about Marcus's bail hit Tom Coleman like a hammer the next morning. He was in his office, trying to sort through paperwork while thinking about the woman and baby sleeping back at his house, when Judge Wilkins sent for him. The judge sat behind his big desk, fingers steepled, eyes tired. "Tom, you know how this territory works," he said. "Marcus has family with money. They posted bail. The law says he can walk free until trial." Tom clenched his jaw. He nearly beat his wife to death. He was drunk and screaming that the baby was worthless for being a girl. "That's attempted murder in my book." The judge sighed. "In your book, maybe, but unless Sarah herself stands in that courtroom and says those words under oath, or you have clear proof he meant to kill her and the child. The law is weaker than we'd like. You sent a telegram to the federal marshal, and that was right. But it'll take weeks before we hear back. Until then, Marcus has rights as her husband. Rights over her. Rights over the child. The words tasted like poison to Tom. She's in no state to testify. She can barely walk to the next room. The judge spread his hands helplessly. Then we do what we can. Keep him under watch. Hope the marshal sends word of any charges in other towns. Maybe there's a pattern we can prove. Until then, you're sheriff. You find a way to keep them safe without breaking the law wide open. On his way out of the courthouse, Tom passed the jail. Marcus stood at the bars, eyes cold, lip curled in a smug half-smile. "They tell me I'll be out soon, Sheriff," he drawled. "My family takes care of their own. I want my wife and my daughter ready when I come for them." Tom stopped, stared him down. "You don't have a daughter. You had a victim, and you lost the right to call yourself a husband the moment you raise your hand to her." Marcus leaned in, voice low and full of hate. "They're mine by law and by God. You can't keep what belongs to me. I'll get the back. You can't watch him every second. Remember that." Tom walked away before his temper pushed him to something he couldn't take back. But those words followed him all the way home. The town did not make things easier. By the time Tom stepped through his own front door, the church ladies had already been there. Sarah sat on the settee, pale but upright, Grace sleeping in her arms. Across from her sat Mrs. Harper and Mrs. Langley, respectable, sharp-eyed women who ran half the town's gossip and all of its charity. Their hats were stiff, their mouths tighter than their corsets. "Sheriff," Mrs. Harper said as he entered, her tone polite but cool. "We were just speaking with Mrs. Whitmore about arrangements." Tom removed his hat slowly. "What kind of arrangements?" Mrs. Langley folded her hands. "It isn't proper for an unmarried woman, especially a married woman whose husband is still alive, to live in a bachelor's home. People talk. You know this. The church charity house is open to her, and there is room at the orphanage for the child until matters are settled." Sarah's arms tightened around Grace at that word. Orphanage, and fear flickered across her face. Tom's voice came out harder than he meant. "She's not going to the orphanage, and Sarah's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Mrs. Harper sniffed. "Sheriff, no one is questioning your kindness, but a baby needs ladies to care for her, and a woman in Mrs. Whitmore's situation needs guidance. A sheriff's home is no place for them. Imagine what people are already saying." Tom stepped closer, his shadow falling over the little parlor. "Let them talk. My house is under my authority. So is my badge. Sarah and Grace are under my protection until I say otherwise. That's the end of it." The ladies exchanged a look, clearly offended, but there was something in his eyes that told them this was not the man to argue with today. They rose, smoothing their skirts. Mrs. Langley gave Sarah a pointed look. "We only want what is proper, dear. Think about your reputation." After they left, Sarah stared at the door, her cheeks burning with shame and helpless anger. "They're right," she whispered. "I'm trouble for you. People will say awful things. You've already done so much. Maybe I should." He cut her off gently. "No, you're not going anywhere. I've lived with ghosts and silence for 3 years. I can live with gossip a while longer." He sat down across from her, meeting her eyes. "You and Grace stay here, as long as you need. The town will get used to it or they won't. Either way, I don't answer to them." She swallowed hard and nodded, tears bright in her eyes. For the first time in years, someone was choosing her without asking anything in return. That night, after Grace was finally asleep and the house was quiet, Sarah sat by the fireplace, hands wrapped around a cup of weak tea. Tom sat nearby, staring into the flames, his hat resting on his knee. The heavy silence between them was no longer the awkward one of strangers. It was the silence of two people carrying more than they knew how to say. At last, Sarah spoke. "You should know," she said slowly, "who we are, where we came from." He looked up, nodding once. "Only if you're ready." She stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. "I married Marcus when I was 16. My mother said it was a good match. He had land, some money, a strong back. He was kind at first, brought me wildflowers, called me his little dove. I thought I was lucky. Her mouth twisted at the memory. But kindness turned to control. He didn't like me talking to other women without his say-so. Didn't like me going into town alone. Then control turned to anger. Anger turned to fists. Tom's hands closed into fists, knuckles white. But he kept quiet and let her speak. "We lost 2 babies," she whispered. Both times, after he'd come home drunk and mad that supper wasn't hot, or the house wasn't clean enough, or I'd said something he didn't like. He'd hit me, kick me, call me useless. The next day, there'd be blood and no baby anymore. The doctor never came. Marcus said it was God's will, and that if I'd been a better wife, God would have given us a son. Her voice shook, but she went on. When I realized I was with child this last time, I hid it as long as I could. I prayed every day for a boy, not because I didn't want a girl, but because I knew what he'd do if it wasn't what he wanted. A month before the birth, when he was drunk, he told me plain, "If it's another girl," he said, "I'll leave her in the woods for the wolves, and I'll leave you for dead beside her." She wiped at her eyes. So when the baby came and I saw her little face, so perfect and so female, I knew he'd rather see her dead than alive. I tried to protect her. You saw how that went. Tom's throat ached with anger and something like awe. He leaned forward, voice low. "You survived him. You protected her as long as you could. That's more than most could have done, Sarah." She shook her head. "He'll come back. Men like Marcus don't let go. I'm so tired of being afraid." He met her gaze, steady as stone. "He will not touch you again," he said. "He will not touch Grace. I swear it, not just as sheriff, as a man." Something in his tone made her believe him, even though the law itself seemed against her. The weeks that followed were a slow, quiet miracle. Winter began to soften. Snow melted from the eaves in long, dripping lines. The sun climbed a little higher in the sky each day. Inside the little house, a new rhythm formed. In the mornings, Tom rose early to bring in wood and stoke the stove while Sarah fed Grace. Sometimes he would come in to find Sarah humming a soft tune, the baby's eyes half closed as she nursed. He would pause in the doorway, catching a glimpse of something that looked almost like peace, and it twisted his heart in a way he couldn't name. As Sarah grew stronger, she insisted on helping. She mended his shirts, skillful fingers sewing up old tears. She swept and aired out rooms that had been closed since Emma's death, opening windows on clear days to let fresh air in. Slowly, carefully, she folded some of Emma's things and stored them in a trunk, always asking Tom first, always respectful. "I can leave this if you want," she'd say, holding up a shawl or dress. He would study a moment, then nod. "It's time," he'd answer, though his voice sometimes caught. In the evenings, after supper, they sat together by the fire. Grace lay on a blanket at their feet, discovering her own fingers and the sound of her own laughter. Tom found himself doing silly things he hadn't done since he was a younger man, making funny faces, bouncing her gently on his knee, letting her grab his nose. Once, when he crossed his eyes at her, Grace burst into the brightest, bubbling laugh they had ever heard. The sound filled the room like sunlight. Sarah laughed too, hand over her mouth, eyes shining. "She thinks you're her father," she said softly before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air. Tom froze for a heartbeat, then looked down at the baby girl clinging to his finger. "Is that wrong?" he asked, voice quiet. Sarah shook her head, eyes wet. "No, it's a miracle." As the snow melted completely and the first tiny shoots of green grass pushed through the earth, something else thawed too. The hard, frozen place inside Tom's chest that had shut down the day Emma died. He caught himself looking at Sarah longer than was proper, noticing the way her hair fell loose at the end of the day, the way she tucked a blanket around Grace with such care, the quiet strength in her eyes. He noticed how natural it felt when their hands brushed while passing a dish, how right it felt when she laughed at something he said. At night, in the small bedroom where he'd finally moved a pallet for himself on the floor so she could have the bed. He lay awake listening to the sound of her breathing and the little sighs Grace made in her sleep. It felt like a home again instead of a graveyard. Sarah, for her part, found herself watching him too. The way he always checked the locks before bed. The way he stepped outside to scan the tree line before relaxing. The way he never raised his voice with her, never grabbed her arm too hard, never used his strength to make her feel small. She had known men who were strong and cruel. Tom was strong and gentle, and that combination was something she had never believed could exist. One evening, after putting Grace down, Tom went to the small wooden box he kept in the back of his closet. He opened it and stared at the simple gold ring inside, Emma's wedding band, which he had not touched since the day he laid her in the ground. His hand shook as he picked it up. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling the weight of the past, and for the first time, the pull of the future. Sarah and Grace had brought life back into a house that had been nothing but shadows. He could feel something growing between them, slow, careful, but real. Tomorrow, he told himself, tomorrow I'll ask her, not out of pity, not because of scandal, because I want them. I choose them. That afternoon, while Sarah napped and Grace gurgled in her cradle, Tom took a quiet walk up the hill to the small cemetery outside town. He stood before Emma's grave for the first time in months. "Emma," he said softly, feeling foolish and comforted all at once. "You know I've loved you every day since you left. That won't change. But there's a woman in my house now who's been through hell. And a little girl who laughs when I make a fool of myself. I think God sent them to me. Or maybe he sent me to them. Either way, I want to ask Sarah to be my wife. Not to replace you. No one could. But to build something new on the broken ground you and I left behind." The wind blew gently through the grass, and he chose to take it as an answer. He went home with the ring in his pocket and a nervous hope he hadn't felt since he was a young man courting Emma. That night, after supper, he sat at the small table, polishing the gold band with a scrap of cloth until it shone. His heart hammered in his chest at the thought of what he would say. In his mind, he had it all planned. He would tell Sarah that her courage humbled him, that Grace had healed places in him he thought were dead, that he wanted to give them his name and his home and whatever years he had left. He would ask her, plain and honest, to marry him, to be his family, to let him be theirs. He slipped the ring into his pocket and decided that at dawn, he would ride out with her to the hill where the wildflowers would soon grow and ask her there, under the open sky. But dawn came sooner and harder than he expected. Before the first light had fully broken the darkness, hooves thundered into the yard. A fist pounded on the door, hard and urgent. Tom grabbed his rifle and opened it to find his deputy, face pale, breath steaming in the cold air. "Sheriff," the young man gasped, "Marcus is gone. Escaped during transfer yesterday. Overpowered a guard. And sir," he swallowed, eyes wide with fear, "he ain't alone. He's got 3 men with him, armed. They're headed this way." The news hit like a bullet, but Tom Coleman did not waste a second. As soon as the deputy's words left his mouth, Tom was already moving. "Saddle up and ride to town," he ordered. "Get the marshal, the judge, every man willing to stand with us. But don't come back unless you've got help. You understand." The deputy nodded, swung back into the saddle, and took off, hooves pounding away into the gray morning. Tom shut the door, turned the bolt, and crossed the room in 3 long strides. "Sarah," he said, voice firm but steady, "wake up." She sat up on the bed, sleepy and confused, clutching the blanket to her chest. "What is it? Is it Grace?" He shook his head, already grabbing rifles from the rack. "Marcus escaped. He's got 3 men with him, all armed. They're coming here." The color drained from her face, but her chin lifted. "Then we get ready." For a moment, their eyes met, and there was no fear there, only a hard, clear understanding that this was the day everything would be decided. Tom moved fast, boarding up windows, pushing heavy furniture against doors, checking the rifles and revolvers one by one. He showed Sarah how to reload quickly, how to keep low, how to listen for breaks in the firing. He dragged the old trunk into a corner, lined it with blankets, and tucked Grace inside, leaving the lid open just enough for air and light. If things get bad, you take her and run out the back, into the trees, he said. There's a narrow trail to the creek. You know the one. Sarah shook her head sharply. We're not running anymore, Tom. Not from him. He wanted to argue, but there was steel in her voice that matched the steel in his hands. Finally, he nodded. Then we stand together. The hours that followed were long and tight as a pulled rope. The winter sky hung low and gray, clouds rolling in over the hills. Every creak of the house sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind sounded like a voice. Tom stayed close to Sarah, moving from window to window, watching the tree line. Inside, Grace cooed and babbled, unaware of the danger, waving her small hands in the air when Sarah peeked in to check on her. At one point, as they shared a simple meal of bread and coffee, Sarah looked at Tom and said softly, I never knew men like you existed. He shrugged, eyes on the door. I never knew I could feel alive again until you and Grace came here. The words hung between them, quiet and real. They both understood that this might be their last honest conversation, and there was a kind of peace in that. As the sun slid behind the pines and the shadows grew long, Tom saw it at last, a flicker of orange moving through the trees. Torches. For riders stepped out of the woods and approached the house, horses snorting, men shifting rifles in their hands. Marcus rode in front, hat low, mouth twisted in a cruel grin. He dismounted and stood in the yard, shouting, Coleman, you got something that belongs to me. Send out my wife and my daughter, and this doesn't have to get ugly. Tom opened a narrow crack in the boarded window and called back, they don't belong to you. Not anymore. You lost that right when you tried to kill them. Marcus laughed, a harsh, broken sound. The law says they're mine. God says they're mine. You're gonna fight both. Tom answered, I'll fight any man who treats his family like property. The hired guns spread out, taking positions around the house. Last chance, Sheriff. Marcus yelled, send them out, or we burn you all out and pick through the ashes. Tom stepped back from the window, checked his rifle, and said simply, get down, Sarah. Then the shooting started. Bullets smashed through window panes, splintered wood, and shattered dishes on the shelf. Grace woke with a scream, her cry cutting through the roar of gunfire. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the trunk, one hand on the baby's back, the other passing ammunition to Tom as fast as she could. Tom fired back, steady and sure, picking his shots. One of the hired guns dropped in the yard, clutching his chest. Tom rolled to another window, fired again, and another man staggered back, his shoulder blooming red. The air inside the house filled with smoke and dust. A bullet grazed Tom's shoulder, spinning him back against the wall. Blood darkened his shirt, but he pushed off and kept going. You're hit, Sarah cried, grabbing a cloth and pressing it to the wound between volleys. I've been hit worse shaving, he grunted, trying to smile. Outside, Marcus raged, screaming at his men to push forward. One of them tried the back door, kicking it hard, but Tom was ready. A shot through the wood sent the man stumbling away, cursing. The hired gun's courage began to crack. One bolted for his horse and rode off into the trees, leaving only Marcus and one loyal man to keep up the attack. Marcus grew wilder, firing again and again at the front door, splinters flying. Sarah, he bellowed, you come out now, or I swear I'll kill that sheriff and make you watch. The last hired gun hooped as he moved closer, taking cover behind a water barrel. Tom could feel the pressure building. They couldn't trade bullets forever. The next move had to count. Sarah looked at Tom, then at the trunk where Grace still cried, her small body shaking with fear. She wiped the tears and ash from her face. This ends tonight, she said quietly. Before he could stop her, she picked up a rifle, took a deep breath, and moved to the front door. Sarah, don't, Tom hissed, reaching for her. She pulled away, eyes blazing. I've been running from him since I was 16. I'm done. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, rifle held in both hands. The cold air hit her full in the face, along with the smell of smoke and gunpowder. Marcus turned, shocked for a heartbeat, then grinned, that same cruel twist of his mouth she knew too well. There she is, he sneered. My wife. Come to her senses. The hired gun beside him shifted his grip on his revolver, watching. Sarah's voice rang clear, carried by the cold air. I'm not your wife, she said. I never was. I was your prisoner. You broke my body, but you never owned my soul. Grace is my daughter, not yours. You will never touch her again. Marcus's face twisted with fury. You think that sheriff can protect you? You think he loves you? He took a step toward the porch, hand reaching for his pistol. You're mine, Sarah. You and that brat. Even God can't change that. In that instant, he lunged, closing the distance, his hands reaching for her throat as they had that terrible night. The rifle slipped from her fingers as he slammed her back against the wall, fingers digging into her skin. She clawed at his wrists, gasping for breath, vision blurring. Inside the house, Tom roared and charged forward, slamming into Marcus and knocking him off the porch. They hit the mud hard, rolling, fists flying. Marcus was younger, stronger, and full of blind rage. He pummeled Tom's wounded shoulder, driving his fist into the same spot again and again until Tom saw stars. Then Marcus grabbed a rock from the ground, heavy and jagged. He pinned Tom with one knee and raised the rock high over his head. You took what's mine, he screamed. I'm going to bash your skull in and make her watch. Tom seemed to slow. Sarah crawled across the porch, fingers stretching toward the fallen rifle. Grace's cries tore through the night, wild and panicked. Tom stared up at the rock, knowing he might not be able to move in time. The rock began to fall. A single gunshot split the air, sharp and final. Marcus jerked, eyes going wide, the rock tumbling from his hand. He looked down at the dark stains spreading across his chest, then slowly turned his head. Sarah stood a few yards away, both hands wrapped around the rifle, barrel still smoking, shoulders shaking. She was never yours, she whispered. Marcus's body sagged and fell into the mud. Tom rolled aside, sucking in air, trying to push himself up. Relief flooded through him, until a low voice came from the shadows beyond the barn. Drop it, lady. Now. The last hired gun stepped out, revolver aimed straight at Sarah's head, eyes cold and steady as stone. The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger, his eyes locked on Sarah, when a night exploded with the thunder of hooves and a harsh shout. Drop that gun. Lantern light swept across the yard as riders surged in from the darkness. Federal marshal at the lead, deputies, and a few armed townsmen behind him. The hired gun froze, weighing his chances, then let the revolver fall into the mud and raised his hands. The marshal swung down from his saddle, eyes taking in the scene in one hard sweep. Marcus bleeding in the dirt, Tom struggling to stand, Sarah shaking with a smoking rifle in her hands, and the echo of Grace's cries pouring from the house. We got your telegram, Sheriff, the marshal said, voice rough but steady. Came as fast as we could. While two deputies dragged the last gunman off and another checked Marcus, the marshal knelt, pressed his fingers to Marcus's neck, and glanced up. Alive, barely. We'll patch him enough to stand trial. After what I've learned about this man, the judge will want to see him breathing. Tom swayed where he stood, blood soaking his shoulder before his knees gave out. Sarah dropped the rifle and caught him as best she could, her bruised throat burning as she whispered, Tom, stay with me. Please. The marshal nodded to one of the men. Get Doc Harrison. Now. Soon the yard was full of voices and movement, but one sound cut through all the rest. Grace's frantic sobs. Sarah tore herself away long enough to rush inside, scoop the baby from the trunk, and press her close, whispering promises that everything was all right even though her own hands still shook. When she stepped back onto the porch with Grace in her arms and saw Tom being lifted onto a wagon, his face pale, but his eyes still open and on her, She felt something deep inside finally believe they might survive this. Back at Tom's house, Doc Harrison worked on them both under the marshal's watchful eye. Tom sat grimly at the table, shirt off, jaw clenched as Doc cleaned and stitched the graze on his shoulder and poked at the bruises already blooming across his ribs. "You two are damn lucky," Doc muttered, "and damn foolish. You ever think of waiting for help?" Tom grunted. Didn't have time to set out tea and invitations. Sarah, her throat bruised and turning purple where Marcus's fingers had dug in, winced as Doc gently checked for breaks. "No fractures," he said. "You'll be sore and hoarse for a while, but you'll live." He glanced between them, exhaling. "I've seen enough death in this town. It's about time I got to say that." Grace fussed from the cradle until Tom reached over with his good arm and lifted her, settling her against his chest. Almost at once, she calmed, little fingers curling into his shirt. The marshal watched that small scene, and something in his hard face softened. "Town saw everything," he said quietly. "Saw you stand your ground. Saw her shoot to save your life. Folks won't be whispering scandal after this. Not with what I brought to show them." He pulled a worn folder from his bag and laid it on the table. "I've been chasing Marcus Whitmore's shadow for 2 territories. In Texas, we found records. Wives and sweethearts with broken bones, miscarriages, one dead under mysterious circumstances. Witnesses too scared to speak then, not so scared now. He ran before we could nail him there, but I've got sworn statements, doctor reports, even a preacher ready to testify. Add tonight. Escape, attempted murder, assault, child endangerment. And that man is either going to swing or spend the rest of his miserable days behind iron." He looked straight at Sarah. "Either way, he'll never darken your door again." For the first time since all this began, Sarah broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent at first, then turning into deep, shaking sobs. She pressed her face into Grace's hair and cried for lost babies, lost years, lost safety, and for the fragile new life she might finally be allowed to have. Tom reached out with his bandaged hand and rested it gently over hers. "It's over," he said softly. "He can't hurt you anymore." The next day, when the marshal had gone to secure Marcus in a guarded cell and the town had quieted, Sarah asked Tom for a private word. Grace napped in her cradle, the house finally still. Sarah stood by the window, fingers twisting in her skirt. "There's something you need to know before you decide anything about us," she began, her voice low. Tom's heart thumped. "Sarah, you don't." She shook her head. "I do. I can't let you make promises without knowing the truth." She stared out at the yard where the mud still showed dark patches from the fight. "Marcus used to say my body was useless," she said plainly. "Said God cursed me, that I couldn't give him a son. But it wasn't me. A traveling physician told me once, quiet as a secret, that he believed Marcus might be the one who couldn't father a child. Marcus never knew I went to see that doctor. If he had, he would have killed us both." She swallowed hard, her hands trembling. "When Marcus was gone for weeks on a cattle drive, I went back to that physician. He was trying something new, a way to help women like me, ones married to men who couldn't give them children. It was a medical procedure, he called it. No affair, no secret lover. Just science in a doctor's hands, and me praying I wasn't damning myself. I was desperate, Tom. I wanted a baby more than I wanted my next breath. I thought if Marcus believed the child was his, the baby might be safe." She turned at last to face him, eyes full of fear and shame. "Grace isn't his by blood. Not at all. She has no tie to him, not even the smallest part. I've been so afraid to say it out loud. Afraid you'd look at me like I was dirty, or a liar, or worse. Afraid you'd see her differently." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint crackle of the fire. Tom's face was unreadable, his gray eyes fixed on hers. Then he stood, slowly, every bruise complaining, and crossed the room. He stopped a foot away, close enough that she could see the tiny scar at his jawline she'd never noticed before. "You did what you had to do to survive," he said quietly. "What you had to do to have Grace. There's no shame in that. Not in my house. Not in my heart. He glanced toward the cradle where the baby slept, cheeks rosy, lips parted. I don't give a damn whose blood runs in her veins. She's yours. That's all that matters. And if you'll have me, she'll be mine too. Not by blood, by choice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small gold ring, its surface freshly polished. I went to Emma's grave before all this, he said. Told her about you, about Grace. Asked if it was all right that I wanted more life instead of just more grief. The wind didn't strike me down, so I took that as a yes. His voice roughened with emotion. Sarah Whitmore, would you and Grace do me the honor of becoming my family? Truly and forever. Her legs nearly gave out. All the years of being treated like property, of being bought and sold and threatened, crashed into the moment where a man was asking, not demanding. Offering, not taking. She covered her mouth with her hand as tears spilled freely, then nodded, again and again. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Tom. 1,000 times yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. And when he kissed her, soft and careful, like she might break, Grace stirred in her cradle and let out a happy little sigh, as if in agreement. Doc Harrison walked in through the open door just then, took one look at them, and snorted. Well, it's about damn time, he muttered. I was starting to think you two were the slowest courtship in Montana. The wedding was set for the following Sunday, the whole town buzzing with talk, but this time the talk was different. Warm, approving, even proud. Sarah should have felt nothing but joy as she folded her few belongings into a small trunk that evening, the lamplight soft and golden. Instead, as she reached the bottom of the box, her fingers brushed an envelope she didn't recognize. Her name was scrawled across the front in Marcus's harsh handwriting. Her stomach dropped. Slowly, she opened it and read the jagged lines inside. I know where you are. I know what you did. When I come for you, you'll wish you died that night. And the bastard child, too. Her hands shook so hard the paper rattled. At the bottom, in smaller, neater letters, was a line that turned her blood to ice. Your mother told me everything. She sends her regards, Em. The room seemed to tilt. Her mother. The woman who had sold her to Marcus like she was livestock. The woman whose beatings had taught her fear long before marriage did. The woman she thought she'd left behind forever. Tom found her sitting on the floor beside the half-packed trunk, the letter crumpled in her fist, her face white as the snow outside. Sarah, he asked, kneeling beside her. What is it? She looked up at him, eyes haunted all over again. We're not safe yet, she whispered. Marcus wasn't the only monster from my past. Tom read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each line, then folded it carefully and set it on the table like it was something rotten. Sarah stood there shaking, her hands twisting in her skirt. My mother sold me to Marcus, she said, voice flat with old pain. Took money and told me I should be grateful. When I tried to run once, she beat me and dragged me back, said no man would want a girl who talked too much. If she told him about the doctor, about how Grace was made, she'll tell anyone anything if it gains her a coin. If she comes here, she won't come to say she's sorry. She'll come to take what she thinks she's owed. She'll try to sell Grace, Tom. I know she will. He stepped closer, took her hands in his good one. Then we don't give her the chance, he said simply. The next morning, with the letter as proof, Tom and the marshal sat in the judge's office while Sarah told her story again, this time with her chin up and her ring shining on her finger. The marshal laid out Marcus's crimes, the pattern of abuse across states, the thread in the letter, and the role Sarah's mother had played in handing her over like property years ago. The judge listened, face grave, then finally nodded. We can't fix the past, he said, but we can damn well put walls around your future. Papers were drawn up that day. Full custody of Grace to Sarah, Marcus's rights as father and husband stripped and sealed by the coming federal trial. A notice went out that if Sarah's mother set foot in the territory to bother her or the child, she would face charges of conspiracy, trafficking, and aiding a wanted criminal. You are not a piece of land to be sold. The judge told Sarah as he signed. You are a free woman under the law. Remember that if any ghost from your past tries to say different. As they walked home, Sarah stopped in the middle of the road, closed her eyes, and took a long, steady breath. For the first time in years, she felt chains she could not see fall away. She can't touch us now, she whispered. Tom slid his arm around her shoulders. No, he said, she can't. With the threat named and answered, the town turned its full attention to the wedding. The same church ladies who once tooted at Sarah now showed up with baskets of fabric, lace, and old ribbons. They measured her with quick, sure hands and argued over hems and sleeves like they had known her all her life. We'll make you something simple and proper, Mrs. Harper said, trying to hide a smile. Can't have a sheriff's bride looking like a scarecrow. Little by little, the dress took shape. A plain but beautiful white gown with tiny hand-sewn flowers at the cuffs. For Grace, they stitched a tiny white dress to match, soft as a cloud. Tom, for his part, could not stop fussing. He polished his boots until they shone, brushed his coat 3 times a day, and wore a path up the hill to Emma's grave. One evening, he stood there with his hat in his hands and spoke into the quiet air. Emma, I'll always love you, he said. Benjamin too. But I'm allowed to live, aren't I? To be a husband again, a father again. I think you like Sarah. She's brave. And Grace, you'd have loved her laugh. He laid wildflowers on the grave, then turned back toward town with lighter steps than on the day of the wedding. The little church filled until there was standing room only. The same hands that had once pointed at Sarah now straightened her veil and carried dishes to the reception table. Tom stood at the front in his best suit, badge shining, hand shaking just enough that Doc Harrison, acting as minister, nudged him with a crooked grin. Breathe, Sheriff. You've stared down worse than a wedding. The doors opened, and Sarah walked down the aisle alone, head high, carrying Grace in her arms. No father to give her away, no family except the one she was about to make. Tom's eyes filled when he saw them, his bride and the little girl who had cracked his stone heart wide open. When they reached the front, Doc nodded for the vows. Tom took Sarah's hand. I promise to protect you, honor you, and love Grace as my own daughter from this day until my last, he said, voice rough but steady. Sarah's eyes shone. I promise to stand beside you, trust you, and build a life filled with the love we both thought we'd lost forever, she answered. At that exact moment, Grace let out a loud, cheerful gurgle that made the whole church laugh. Doc wiped at his eyes and declared, by the authority given to me, and with a great deal of relief, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Sheriff, before she changes her mind. Their first true kiss as husband and wife was simple and sure, with Grace squirming happily between them as the town broke into applause. The reception spilled out into the town square with music, stew, bread, and dancing under strings of lanterns. Tom waltzed with Sarah in slow circles, one arm around her waist, the other steadying Grace against his chest. For the first time in 7 years, she moved to music without fear of a blow. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new kind of normal. Sarah carefully packed some of Emma's things into a chest, leaving a few special items: a shawl, a sketch, a toy horse, where they had always been, not as ghosts but as honored memories. She added her own touches to the house: curtains she sewed by hand, jars of wildflowers on the table, a fresh quilt on the bed. Tom built a small addition on the side of the house, a room that would one day be Grace's and later another child's. A traveling sketch artist came through town and left behind a portrait of the 3 of them. Tom with his steady gaze, Sarah with her soft smile, and Grace in the middle, grabbing at Tom's beard. They hung it on the wall where the birth certificate once stood alone. One evening, when Grace was old enough to toddle around and babble, she pulled herself up on Tom's leg, looked up at him, and said clear as sunrise, "Papa." The word hit him like a blessing. Sarah covered her mouth, tears spilling over as Tom scooped the little girl up, his voice breaking. "She chose you," Sarah whispered. He shook his head gently. "No," he said. "We chose each other. All three of us." By summer, the garden behind the house was alive with color. Beans climbing their poles, tomatoes fat on the vine, flowers lining the fence. Grace ran through the grass, laughing, her short legs pumping, while Tom pretended to be a slow, clumsy bear chasing her. Sarah watched from the porch, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. When she finally told Tom she was expecting, she did it quietly over supper, fingers tight around her cup. "Tom," she said, I think we're going to have another baby." For a second, he just stared, fork in midair. Then his whole face lit up in pure, boyish joy. He stood, pulled her up with him, and spun her in a careful circle, laughing like she had never heard him laugh before. "Boy or girl," he said, setting her back down, "I don't care. They'll be loved. That's all that matters." Word spread, and the town brought small gifts: a carved cradle, tiny knitted socks, a patchwork blanket. Pain had not vanished from their story, but it no longer ruled it. One quiet evening, as the sun went down in a wash of gold over the hills, Tom sat at the table with a leather-bound journal Sarah had given him. "Write it down," she'd said. "So one day, Grace and a new baby will know how we got here." He dipped his pen and wrote slowly. "I thought my life ended the day I buried Emma and our son. I thought God was done with me. But then came a cold night, a scream in the woods, a woman in a pool of blood, and a baby with a grip strong enough to catch my heart. Pain does not leave. It makes room. Now I carry Emma and Benjamin with me still, but I carry Sarah and Grace too, and the child yet to come. I am no longer a man waiting to die. I'm a husband and a father again. My cup overflows." Sarah came up behind him, read over his shoulder, and kissed his cheek, her hand resting over his. Grace crawled over, pulled at his pant leg, and he lifted her into his lap. Later, when the lamps were low, he carried Grace to her cradle, Sarah at his side, her other hand resting on her growing belly. He hummed the same lullaby he once sang for a child he never got to raise. But now the song ended in peace, not loss. "Sleep now, little one, safe and warm," he sang softly. "Papa's here to keep you from harm." Grace's eyes fluttered shut, her chest rising and falling in easy rhythm. Sarah leaned into him. "You saved us," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "No," he said. "We saved each other." Outside, the wind moved through the pines, no longer a haunting scream, but a soft, steady breath. Inside the small house at the edge of the Montana wilderness, a sheriff, his wife, their daughter, and the promise of new life stood wrapped in a peace they had all fought hard to earn. And this time, it felt like it was theirs to keep.